This edition of The Briefing was first broadcast on the 30th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme, we'll be in Seoul to get the latest on the tragic plane crash yesterday. Then...
This is a sad day, but it brings back an incredible amount of good memories.
Joe Biden pays tribute to Jimmy Carter, the former US president who's died at the age of 100. We'll look back at his life. We'll have a roundup of trade and economy news and hear some of the stories making headlines in Asia. Plus...
You're green. I am.
The film Wicked has become the highest-grossing Broadway adaptation in global box office history. We'll ask what we've been watching and what lies in store for 2025. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. On Sunday, a plane carrying 181 people crashed in South Korea, killing all but 2 people on board in the country's worst domestic civil aviation disaster. Well, I'm joined now from Seoul by John Lee, who's editor of Korea Pro, to give us more detail. John, what do we know for sure about this incident? What happened?
Well, what do we know for sure? I'm afraid that I cannot answer that question because there's a lot of speculation going on. Initially, there was a lot of speculation that the plane crash was the result of the plane being coming into contact with some birds. However, excuse me. However, later on, there was also some speculation that it might have been because of a landing gear problem. Now, we won't know for certain what exactly happened until, as what the experts are saying, for a few months or even for a few years. The investigators were able to salvage the black boxes, but that's going to take time to analyze as to what exactly happened. But the thing that people are most paying attention to at the moment is the concrete barrier that the plane crashed into as it tried to make an emergency landing. The concrete barrier, as it turns out, was not a foldable or a collapsible structure. As it turns out, many airports around the world have these kinds of structures which carry antennas that allow for planes to make emergency landings. But this structure that was in Wuhan International Airport was not a collapsible one. And there's been a lot of talk as to why it was not collapsible. The South Korean government has been saying that these kinds of structures are located in every airport in the country. But this is something that will have to wait for ongoing investigations.
So what is Jeju Air and what's its safety record?
Jeju Air is one of those low-budget flights, airlines. And as far as safety records go, this is the first major disaster that the airline has ever encountered. When the company's president was first informed about this, he didn't waste any time in apologizing for this tragic accident, but he also defended the company's record, saying that the company had never experienced these kinds of accidents in the past. However, just today, after the government announced that there was going to be an inspection on all Boeing 737-800 planes, which are numerous in South Korea's many different airline fleets, there was another plane in that same airline that also had problems in the landing gear. And so this might be a bigger problem than many people are first anticipating, or as much as the company is willing to downplay.
So you're saying that it could be something to do with that specific craft. I mean, we know that Boeing's had a lot of troubles recently. What can you tell us about the 737-800?
As far as that particular model goes, Boeing has been quite tight-lipped about this particular accident. As you pointed out, there have been many incidents with Boeing aircraft around the world that have had trouble this past year. And Boeing and Jeju Air are right now cooperating very closely to see what exactly went wrong. But again, at this point, it's all just conjecture and speculation. There are no hard, concrete facts.
So what's going to happen now? What action will be taken?
Immediately, what the South Korean government did was to declare Wuhan International Airport an emergency zone. Now, what that entails is that it has opened up the budget to all sorts of first responders and ways to help the families deal with what's going on at the moment. And so that's immediately what's going on politically. As you or your listeners might be aware, South Korea has had a bit of a leadership crisis going on since the president was impeached, followed by the first acting president's impeachment as well. And this accident occurred just less than 2 days after the second acting president, who is the finance minister, took over the reins of power. And so there's intense scrutiny going on at the moment as to how disaster management will be properly taken care of, because the opposition party, for its own reasons, for its own political reasons, have been aiming their sights at the finance minister to threaten him with impeachment if he doesn't go along with their plans to appoint constitutional court justices. Now, for the time being, it seems that the opposition party is taking a step back from their impeachment threats, but this is only for the time being.
And that's because they're concentrating on this disaster.
Very much so, yes.
We understand that there are a lot of grieving families who are actually still camped out at the airport, and there's a lot of grievance there. I mean, people are very angry.
Very much so. Now, Busan International Airport is an international airport, but it primarily serves South Cholla province and the cities around that area. And so all of the victims from except for the 2 Thai nationals, they are from that region. And so because so much of the deaths were focused on one specific geographic area, this has been very hard-hitting for that particular region. And so naturally, the family members are incredibly angry and they are grieving over what had happened. But as I mentioned earlier, this will not be a matter of days before we find out what happened. And they are naturally and understandably frustrated with the lack of answers that they're getting.
Now, 2 people did survive this crash. They were both members of the air crew, cabin staff, I understand. Have they actually said anything yet?
Only one person has said something, but it was mostly what happened, because the cabin crew attendant woke up from the hospital while being treated. Since then, there have been no official statements from either of those 2 survivors.
And finally, John, how is this being covered in Korea? Is the media angry about this?
Everyone in the media, at least, is in the mainstream media, they are taking a very measured response because, again, no one wants to speculate about what's going on. And because of the uncertainty going on within the government right now, they don't want to inflame tensions and make things unnecessarily unstable. But this is more of an unwritten agreement between the media outlets and the government and the different political parties. Now, how the media might start portraying this differently will depend on how well or not well that the government is able to manage disaster management.
John, thank you very much indeed. That's John Lee there speaking to us from Seoul. Now, here's Hassan Anderson with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Israeli forces carrying out a weeks-long offensive in northern Gaza have ordered any residents remaining in Beit Hanun to leave the town for their own safety. Approximately 325,000 people have fled since Israel began a new offensive and tightened sieges on the area in early October, cutting off almost all aid. Croatia's incumbent president Zoran Milanovic has won most of the votes in the first round of a presidential election but must now face a runoff against a ruling party candidate. With nearly all of the votes counted, left-leaning Milanovic won 49%, while his main challenger Dragan Primorac, a candidate of the ruling conservative HDZ party, trailed far behind with 19%. And shoppers in the UK have complained after seeing Easter eggs already out on supermarket shelves. Easter Sunday is 4 months away, falling on the 20th of April next year, but chocolate eggs and hot cross buns have already been spotted for sale in shops including Morrison's, Tesco and Asda. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Hassan. Former US President Jimmy Carter has died aged 100. The 39th President of the United States lived longer than any president in history, serving one turbulent term in the White House before building a reputation as a global humanitarian and a champion of democracy. Here's Monocle's Andrew Muller taking a look back at his life.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
Jimmy Carter could not have won any other presidential election in U.S. history, and indeed he didn't. He became the 39th president of the United States in 1976, running against the profoundly uninspiring figure of Gerald Ford, the only man in American history to have served as vice president and president without ever being elected to either office, and a Republican Party exhausted and tarnished by the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. He lost office 4 years later, thrashed 44 states to 6 by Ronald Reagan.
The presidency. Reagan is our projected winner. Ronald Wilson Reagan of California, a sports announcer, a film actor.
The rest of Carter's life would be spent trying to persuade America, the world, and perhaps himself that this judgment of his presidency had been unfair. James Earl Carter Jr. was born to a farming family in Plains, Georgia on October 1st, 1924. After graduating from university, he served for 7 years in the U.S. Navy, including a stint as an officer aboard a submarine. Back home in Georgia, after leaving the armed forces, he won election to the state senate in 1962. Throughout his career, Carter perceived no conflict between his conservative Baptist background and a passion for civil rights. Indeed, he believed them parts of one whole. He was a staunch pro-Kennedy Democrat, which wasn't always an easy thing to be in the American South of the 1960s. However, in a symbolic shift in 1970, Carter replaced as Georgia's governor Lester Maddox, an old-school race-baiting fire-breather.
Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly, that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Carter positioned himself as the embodiment of the so-called New South, propounding a folksy liberalism that would later be sold more cunningly and more successfully by a young Arkansas lawyer named Bill Clinton. Carter convincingly won the 1976 Democratic nomination by seeing off 2 other governors who represented his party's eccentric extremes, Jerry Moonbeam Brown of California and George Segregation Forever Wallace of Alabama.
Fellow citizens, I thank you for the nomination you've offered me.
Carter's brief presidency was not without domestic accomplishment. The establishment of a Department of Education, a shoring up of Social Security, a reduction in unemployment. But the purse-lipped homespun piety that he brought to Washington from Plains was never far from the surface. In 1979, with the country beleaguered by an energy crisis, he gave a bizarre sermon, the so-called National Malaise speech, in which he admonished Americans for being self-indulgent and materialistic. He might not have been wrong, but he was assuredly unwise to say so.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
It was abroad that Carter really floundered, and worse, was seen to flounder by an American people who'd grown used to the idea that they were an awesome, undefiable superpower. Carter's presidency became defined by events in Tehran in 1979, when 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days by zealous students under the command of radical cleric Ayatollah Khomeini.
The lives of our people in Iran are at stake. I must emphasize the gravity of the situation.
Though rescue attempts were planned and one attempted, with tragic results, Carter, and America with him, was made to look impotent and indecisive. As a crowning insult, the hostages were released literally as Carter's successor, the indefatigably optimistic, straight-shooting matinee idol Ronald Reagan, was taking the oath of office.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute...
Carter indisputably accomplished more once out of office than in it. He assumed the role of freelance diplomat, travelling extensively between crisis-plagued regions, eventually winning the 2002 Nobel Prize for Peace in recognition of his efforts in conflict resolution, although few of the conflicts with which he concerned himself, notably Israel versus Palestine, are resolved.
It is with a deep sense of gratitude that I accept this prize. I'm grateful to my wife, Rosalind, to my colleagues at the Carter Center, and to many others who continue to seek an end to violence and suffering throughout the world.
His greatest legacy may be the work of his NGO, the Carter Center, in disease control. When the Carter Center began tackling the ghastly parasite guinea worm in Africa and Asia in 1986, it affected 3.5 million people. In 2014, 126 cases were reported worldwide. That astonishing accomplishment in itself would amount to a laudable legacy.
No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
On balance, Jimmy Carter deserves better from posterity than being remembered principally for having spent 4 years of a long and productive life doing a job for which he was spectacularly ill-suited.
Andrew Muller, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And it's time now for us to join Vicky Price, economist and former joint head of the UK government's Economic Service. Vicky, many thanks for coming on The Briefing once again. We're having a look at economy news, and there are optimistic forecasts for the UK after all the gloom. Tell us more.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon. It is very surprising, actually, that suddenly we have some optimism coming through. All the surveys that have been done until now suggested a substantial drop in confidence among businesses in particular. And the later survey suggests that perhaps there is something there. Maybe businesses are rethinking a little bit the outlook for the future. Maybe they do now see that demand can be higher. After all, the government is going to be spending rather a lot of money over the next couple of years. So optimism seems to be on the up. There are two surveys, one by Lloyds Bank and one by KPMG. Now, the thing to watch is that the KPMG one is very much focusing on the financial sector. The financial sector has done rather well, not just in the UK, but also in other countries. And the main reason for that has been the fact that interest rates have stayed higher for longer than anyone anticipated. And when that is the case, then the margin that banks make between the money that is deposited and what they pay for it, and also what they get on loans is considerably bigger, and that's pretty good for them because they tend to keep that margin higher at times of high interest rates, and that actually is quite beneficial for them. Plus, of course, the fact that the government has indicated already that they will continue with the deregulation element that the previous government, the Conservative government and Jeremy Hunt had started on the financial sector. And what is more, it's now encouraging the regulators to look more to use the financial services in a way that brings more growth. So all this is pretty positive for the banking sector. And I think that's one of the reasons why that second survey, the KPMG one, is now quite optimistic.
And does that optimism spread to Europe? What's the picture there?
There is a little bit of that going on. I mean, European stock markets have done quite well. I mean, there is a big exception, and that's the French one, of course. But if you look also at the banking sector in Europe, there have been similar tendencies. Interest rates have come down a little bit faster in Europe than has been the case in the UK. But nevertheless, they're still high, and they are still high in real terms for a number of countries, but coming down. But the banks have managed to do reasonably well by benefiting from the margin again that I mentioned before, and also they had to a very considerable extent hedged against declines in interest rates. So they've done okay, and also lending seems to be expanding again in a number of places. Of course, there is huge variability when you look at countries in Europe. I mean, Germany in particular suffering from periods of recession over the last year, but and also now, of course, with France and the political uncertainty that's there. But overall, if you look at stock markets, they've done reasonably well, up on the year, not as well as has been happening in the US, of course, but doing reasonably well despite all the headwinds that have been against them. So yes, the banks have benefited from a slightly better environment, and so the banking sector ends 2024 in quite a good shape. And
looking further afield, is Japan on the mend?
Well, that's a big question mark. I mean, Japan, as we know, has not done very well for decades now, and the expectation for this year is that it will grow by just 0.5%. But there are some indications that perhaps 2025 will be better. What we're seeing is that although manufacturing, for example, has declined for the last 6 months or so, in fact, that decline has stabilized, and now we're almost at neutral rates. So it means that perhaps we're going to start seeing some improvements happening at the beginning of 25. So that's a positive sign. I mean, Japan has suffered for a long time from a lack of workers. It has an aging population, and it's a country that actually has the largest percentage of over 65s working than any country I can see. I just looked at the data, and it's quite important for them to do so, because the young are not coming into the labour force as fast as they're used to, and of course Japan has not really been big on migrant workers, really letting them in. So, but there is some confidence there. And if you look at the underlying data for the latest manufacturing PMI, the figures have just come out, which suggest a bit of stabilization in the economy. What you see is that business optimism is quite high, even though orders are not particularly strong. They're quite soft, but there seems to be expectation that there will be a lot of investment happening in the future, new products coming on. So yes, perhaps we will see something. And remember, there's one last thing about Japan, of course, is that it's finally got a bit of inflation of about 2.5% to 3%, somewhere around there. And interest rates are still very, very low. Real interest rates are negative. Interest rates are 0.25%, the central bank ones. So that should give some impetus for growth as well.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed. That's Vicky Price there, and you're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Next up, we have a roundup of stories from Asia with our Deputy Head of Radio, Tom Webb. Tom, Vicky was just talking about how Japan is really not keen on a migrant workforce, and the same could be said for South Korea.
Absolutely, and that is how I was going to segue into this story, because South Korea are very wary of migrant workers, which is why this new expansion of a program, the Foreign Nanny Program, has been delayed. Now, the Foreign Nanny Program was created to help raise the country's birth rate, easing childcare, particularly for couples with double income households. However, it's not been a success. And I say the expansion's been delayed because it was tried out in Seoul with 100 workers for 142 households. Now, they lost 2 workers immediately because they never reported to work. So that caused a lot of problems with people that were very wary of migrants. And also many of the households cancelled participation in the programme because it was costly and there were curfews. The workers stopped at 10 p.m. So this was going to be rolled out in February 2025 for the rest of the country, but what with the crisis in politics and what we're hearing today on the programme, it has been scrapped.
And these migrant workers, largely Filipino and paid below the minimum wage.
That's another aspect of why this is so controversial, because the law meant that they could pay the workers only $7 an hour, which is well below the national minimum wage. And again, that has caused issues with politicians on the other side of the debate that don't see it as right.
Let's go to Japan now, and we're talking about climate here, and 2024, which will go down as the hottest year on record.
Now, we complain a lot about the weather here in London, and New Year's Eve is coming and we're ready for a storm and cold weather. Japan have had not only typhoons, they had Typhoon Shanshan earlier, which caused devastation and landslides, but they've also had a record summer, temperatures over 1 degree on average. And the sizzling summer has caused all sorts of issues with the economy, people not wanting to go out shopping, so the high streets suffered. However, air conditioning units have been sold in enormous numbers. 440,000 were sold. That's 13% increase. And that's a lot of schools buying them. They also have misters as well to cope with the heat. And that's not the only sort of impact. There's been terrible farming problems. Kimchi has gone up all around the world because of cost of cabbages going up because of a poor harvest. Per kilogram, it's now 417 yen. It's a huge amount. And there's also a lot of farm theft because of this. Cabbages have been robbed from farms because they've become so valuable.
That's extraordinary. I guess hot weather is particularly difficult to deal with if you are permanently wearing a fur coat.
That is correct. Are you making a segue here?
I'm sort of trying quite a clumsy one that I was hoping you'd pick up with and run.
I'm sorry. Oh, yes, no, of course. Fur coat. Dog fur. Is that what we're doing? This is a statue dedicated to a dog. Now, you own a dog, Bella. If Bella was to get a statue, what would she get it for?
Oh, she'd get it for just being the best good girl in the world.
She is. She is a very, very good girl. There is already a very famous dog in South Korea called... I remember the name of the dog. It's Hachiko, which is the dog that waited a very, very long time, years and years, for his owner to come home, and the owner never did. So there's a bronze statue of said dog. There is one now for this beautiful dog called Eno. It is very revered across the country because it is the grandfather. It is the grand puppy of all living Shiba dogs. There's 600,000 around the world. This was the very first dog. A hunter owned it, lost it, a dentist picked it up, took it to Tokyo and bred it like crazy. And now there is a lovely granite statue in honor of this dog. The granite statue was very difficult to make because the person that usually builds statues in public places thought the legs were too thin to support the body of the very furry dog. However, they found a dog statue specialist who created this beautiful turf for it to stand on. And now it sits outside its very first address.
I'm so relieved to hear that, Tom. Thank heavens it all worked out. Tom Webb, thank you very much indeed. This is The Briefing. And finally, at this time of the year, viewing figures soar as many people use the holiday period to catch up with movies and television, often screening the same favourites every year. One of the traditional Christmas films is It's a Wonderful Life. Frank Capra's classic is a feel-good watch, but fans are appalled by the version currently showing on Amazon Prime. Well, here to discuss this and other movies with me, other movie news with me, is Karen Krasanovic. Karen, hello to you.
Hello.
What is wrong with Amazon Prime's version of It's a Wonderful Life?
Oh, just everything. Well, it seems that Hoopla Digital, which is a supplier, I'm not really trying to track down how it was actually edited, but the It's a Wonderful Life has always had copyright problems, which is one of the reasons why it's so popular. But what's happened is that they've taken out all of the depressing features and kept in all of the euphoric features. And anybody that knows the movie, they know the story is of George Bailey, who is one of the favorites of a small town. He comes to a financial crisis. He thinks he should kill himself for his insurance money, and he's saved by an angel. And the angel shows him his life, or shows him the world, what it would be like without him. And in this version, all of that's missing. The part where he doesn't exist, which is pretty grim. I mean, it turns the town into some sort of terrible nightlife city. That's all removed. So it's just the euphoric parts. It's also shorter, so the people don't have to go through the depressing parts that are actually educational.
That's extraordinary. It seems, as you say, like a very bad decision. One film that has proved a holiday hit is Universal's Wicked. So it's officially become the highest-grossing Broadway adaptation in global box office history. I think it's generated something like $634 million worldwide, and that's just in 6 weeks. Tell us more.
Well, okay, the thing that you have to know about Wicked is, musicals are often a hard sell in the cinema. They're great on Broadway and on stage, but they have problems with in the film world. And the thing about Wicked is that it is the second most popular musical theater version, right behind The Lion King. And this particular version, which is one of two, has been so carefully marketed and carefully made that it's actually I think it's learned lessons from previous mistakes. For example, John M. Chu, who is the director, also directed a really wonderful and Underseen in the Heights, which came out during COVID or just post-COVID. He's done both of these versions because, as I said, there's two parts. And this not only has a sing-along version, which I attended here in the States, but it's reaching out to all sorts of different people who might not like musicals. And I think that the combination of it being well-known, being unusual, and also well-marketed has made it really an enjoyable experience for people who don't really like musicals.
Let's look forward to 2025. So the newly knighted director, Christopher Nolan, has revealed his next project, and it's a story dating back to the 8th century.
I know, it's amazing. Now, the reason I'm liking this story a lot is that Christopher Nolan, you think, who cares what what a director makes next? They've always got things in rotation. But Christopher Nolan seems to take these impossible ideas, the impossible topics, the Odyssey, which is one of the oldest epic poems available to mankind, and he's going to make it a mythic action epic. It's going to be shot also in IMAX or available on IMAX screens. Now, let's not forget that when he was making Oppenheimer, people were going, well, it's Oppenheimer. Who's going to want to see that? That was made for a $100 million budget, and it made $972 million. Also, it did really, really well at IMAX. So I think Nolan has a touch to take classical or unusual stories and bring them to the cinema. And I think that's why this is exciting. Of course, we're not going to see this until 2026, but 2025 has a lot to offer as well.
Such as, you did send through a list and I looked through and I couldn't find a single thing. But within it, there was really nothing that excited me, Karen. We were looking at, it's sort of Snow White and various sort of cartoon things or violent things, and just nothing nothing that grabbed me in particular. So please try and excite me. What should I be looking for?
Certainly. Well, I think that there's a huge variety of things, which is nice. It's not only comic book reboots and adaptations from best-selling novels, novels that you've already read, Georgina, I'm sure, but sequels also to originals. And I think there is, you think Jurassic World Rebirth, who cares? But the Superman, there's a new Superman coming out, and I think it's going to be great. Yes. We need to see another Superman because it's a great story. There's also Mickey 17 from Bong Joon-ho, which has kind of been hanging around a little bit, finally getting released. There's a new Avatar film. Why not? You haven't seen Blue People for a while. And Danny Boyle with 28 Years Later, which should be exciting. And let's not forget, I'm going to go back to Superman. It's James Gunn, so it's going to be fun. But there's also Wolfman. The great Universal horror movies now coming back to a different generation. I think that's extremely exciting. You're not excited, I can tell.
Sorry, Karen.
That's all right. How about the John Wick spinoff with Ana de Armas? Yes, called Ballerina. That's coming out in June. That should be exciting.
It does look good, actually. So thank you for that.
You're
Karen
welcome.
Kosanovich, thank you very much indeed. And sadly, that's all we have time for on this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Tom Webb. Our studio manager was Flynn Simons, and The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.